Welcome. My name is Roy Childs, the author of many different psychometric tools, and this video is about one that helps people to manage adversity. This is the territory we call resilience, and specifically I will explain how the Resilience Scales Questionnaire, the RSQ, identifies those critical elements required to build resilience and how it allows people to compare their perceptions with the perceptions of various groups. The RSQ covers ground that traditional resilience questionnaires have ignored, specifically mapping how people actually change under pressure. I hope you find this video useful. So what I will cover will be in 4 steps as follows. The first is clarifying the territory. This means making it easier for people to recognize resilience when they see it. The next is making the concept accessible and useful. This means taking that small word resilience, recognizing the complexity that it covers, and deconstructing it into manageable and useful elements. Then it's how to make the measurements meaningful. This means going beyond a simple questionnaire survey of people's beliefs, which produces a generalized and often superficial answer, to focusing on the more fundamental question, which should be at the core of resilience: how people change under pressure. And finally, how do we make the results useful for change and development? This means going beyond the measurement. One of our strap lines is, "You do not fatten a goose by measuring it." In other words, measurement is the stimulus for action. It is not the action itself. Hence, with the RSQ, it not only provides indicators of specific areas to address, but also it provides suggestions for behavioural change. To help you recognise resilience, first try to identify people that in your mind clearly demonstrate it. Perhaps 2 characters from literature can prompt you a little. For me, it is Homer's Odysseus and Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov that epitomise someone who's got it and someone who hasn't. Consider Odysseus, who for years tried to get home, but encounters challenge after challenge, the battle with the Cyclops, being captivated by the sirens and more. He is almost the archetypal resilient person. So what defines him is certainly the way he overcomes and succeeds, but really it's about how he is never daunted. He never gives up, even when the odds are so stacked against him. By contrast, Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, professes a high level of self-belief. He sees himself as better and more worthy than the rest of humanity, and this allows him to justify the murder of the pawnshop owner. However, his belief is only skin deep. He becomes racked with doubt and eventually descends into madness. Clearly, we recognise resilience through people's resolve and success in spite of the obstacles and difficulties that could derail them. But the difference between the strong and the weak is not giving up after defeat. One way to summarise what resilience is the ability to bounce back in the way that a tennis ball does. No matter how hard you hit it, it comes back to you ready for more. And we can contrast this with a table tennis ball, where pressure makes it dysfunctional, like Raskolnikov. Another image that summarises resilience is the Bobo doll. This is the doll that you can hit and it just keeps coming back to the vertical, captured in the words of Confucius when he said, "Our greatest glory is not never falling, but in rising every time we do fall." But this way of defining resilience still leaves great difficulties for measuring it. This is because it manifests itself in so many different ways in different people. Think of what you mean by pressure. For some people, it may be needing to engage with a large group of people. For others, it may be the opposite, such as being socially isolated and alone. The difficulty that we have in recognizing resilience is because pressure is self-defined and our reactions can be quite different. So to use another metaphor, consider this pot of boiling water as representing an adverse or pressured environment. Now, if you are a carrot and get plunged into that environment, you can become soft and squashy. But if you are an egg, you go from being and appearing fragile and breakable to becoming tough and hard-boiled. And if you are a coffee bean, perhaps you then fill the whole space with an aroma. Whether you like this metaphor or not, it illustrates how trying to identify the many different ways that people respond to pressure would involve far too many varied expressions. We also need to recognise that people's reactions to pressure can involve a wide range of emotions and thoughts commonly associated with anxiety, which goes up and down. That is normal. We can all experience fear, doubt, sadness, dejection. We all fluctuate on these barometers. To overcome these many difficulties, the RSQ identifies those characteristics that resilient people have in common, but more specifically, those characteristics that are most useful to focus on if you want to build resilience. These can be classified using the ABC lens, the affective, behavioural and cognitive domains. But let me put that into more understandable language. And so the behavioural is what we do, the actions. The cognitive is what we think, thoughts. And the affective is what we feel, feelings. Having talked about constructing the RSQ model, it may now seem odd to talk about deconstructing it. However, what makes the RSQ so useful is that it breaks this complex concept of resilience down into bite-sized elements. This means that we can focus on more specific elements which makes building resilience more manageable. And these component parts are as follows. Under actions, the focus is on control, how we control ourselves, i.e. self-discipline, which involves having a strength of purpose. This is illustrated here with the self-discipline of a martial arts practitioner. But let us also recognise that some self-discipline can be counterproductive, as illustrated here by obsessional control, constant hand washing. The other element is how we control our environment, including other people. Again, this can be highly disciplined and necessary, as illustrated here by a very disciplined firefighter, but again, there is a negative control, perhaps illustrated here by the way in which Alan Sugar or Donald Trump portray control in the program called The Apprentice. Under thoughts, the focus is on what we say or believe about ourselves. And on the inside, this reflects self-belief, and the person who epitomises that the most for me is Nelson Mandela. How he managed 27 years in prison and yet was finally released and emerged with such dignity and lack of recrimination, this must reflect a very deep sense of his own value and self-belief. Of course, some people have an excessive sense of their own worth, which is not always justified, as illustrated here by Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection. Turning these thoughts to the outside, we get optimism. This was potentially illustrated by Philippe Petit, who had such an optimistic view of his own abilities that he took the challenge to walk a tightrope between the Twin Towers in 1974. However, that was well-founded optimism, whereas sometimes it is a little delusional, as is illustrated here by the boy taking on this rather daunting wrestler. Under feelings, the focus is on our emotional state, which on the inside is how we experience our moods, and on the outside is how we express them, our reactions. However, our research suggested that this distinction was very difficult to justify, and these became combined as an underlying characteristic best described as emotional tolerance. This is illustrated here as being emotionally trustful, but the negative of this is experiencing every challenge with a sense of fear and inadequacy. Now this brings me on to how we can measure resilience. And typically, questionnaires designed to measure resilience can be somewhat simplistic, using a very obvious statement along the lines of "I am resilient" and inviting simple ratings, often on a 5-point scale known as a Likert scale. This has various problems in that people do not necessarily understand what is meant by resilience. They also have no real benchmark of their own level of resilience compared to others, and we find that people use this scale with a central tendency, i.e. they bunch towards the middle, and this reduces the scale's ability to differentiate between people. In addition, such scales are relatively easy to manipulate. I mean, imagine if you were applying for a job, how would you answer it? Even esteemed questionnaires like the NEO ask questions like this one and this one, and these are very transparent and highly influenced by social desirability. The RSQ deals with these issues in two ways. It increases the effective breadth of the scale by labelling both ends or poles. As here, you can see "I am reactive" versus "I am resilient." This pairing was done by analysing the desirability of each pole when trialled as a single statement, i.e. using the typical Likert scale format. And then the two poles were selected so that there was an equivalent attraction to both poles. When we asked people who rated being reactive more highly than being resilient, they explained that they identified with being sensitive and responsive rather than being tough and insensitive. This kind of pairing leads to a higher range of scores on all the scales. So, now think about the attraction to these two poles. I stick within my capabilities, or I take on a challenge. Identify which pole you find attractive and then try to understand the attraction that some people may have to the other pole. Now, it is not always obvious why, but careful research may even allow us to use such opaque questions like "I'm a rabbit" versus "I'm a squirrel." We don't always need to understand why an item works well for it to be useful. The other advantage of the RSQ format is how it makes it harder to impression manage. We can understand that people do this in a physical way, such as Madonna here and then here, or how Michael Jackson went from this to this. Impression management is about how much makeup we put on when we present ourselves to the outside world, or what mask we put on when we are trying to appear as something we may not feel inside. Perhaps it is worth now reflecting on how you respond to pressure. We can all experience some of these, but do you recover quickly like the tennis ball or the Bobo doll? Or do you feel more crushed and need time and attention to recover your bounce? Even more significant is how the RSQ goes beyond the vague generalities identified by other questionnaires. No matter how you see yourself typically, the heart of the matter is how you react to pressure. And no matter how you rate the "I am resilient" type of question, which is benchmarked very differently by different people, by asking how that rating changes under pressure, we now have a gap to analyse. However, again, in the research, we found that people interpreted the under pressure question in different ways. Some said that they found pressure stimulating, and others found it debilitating. And we resolved this by separating pressure into stretch, a positive view of pressure, and stress, a more negative view of pressure. This has greatly enriched the person's ability to express their resilience through the RSQ. The result is that the RSQ reports can summarise people's results showing change under pressure like this. This example shows that a person with a typical self-belief score of 8 drops to 7 when stretched and to 6 when stressed. These numbers are what are called STEN or standard scores, which reflect how the person compares to different groups. The interpretation of the RSQ is enhanced by being able to compare with different groups. For example, one group is based on people exploring themselves in a development context. But we know that people answer differently in different contexts, and so it may sometimes be appropriate to see how they compare to people who have a motivation to present an image such as these or these. But as we know, people find it hard to interpret just numbers. So the RSQ reports provide a narrative based on the scores. There's a summary description, and then, in fact, it identifies and interprets differences between the typical, the stretch and the stressed answers, and comments on unusual patterns such as people who claim to have more self-belief when under stress. The report also offers some challenging questions based on the results which can be used by the person themselves to deepen their self-understanding, or by an interviewer if the RSQ is being used as part of a selection process. And in addition, there are development suggestions that help a person begin the difficult task of building greater resilience. So the RSQ is part of a much more integrated way of looking at people, and the unifying concept applied here, which involves people's values and aspirations and how they're stressed and the roles that they play and their underlying personality, is all linked together by the unifying concept of their identity. So thank you for listening. I hope you have found it useful. And if you want to find out more about the RSQ or some of our other tools, please reach out using the details here on the right of the screen. Thank you again for listening.